I'm John Lockren and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Education, and I'm thrilled to see such an incredible audience here tonight for Dean's lecture. Before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'll pay my respects to elders both past and present. And as I look around the room here today, it's a wonderful array of age, I better stop there. I just better listen to that inside voice. I just wanted to say before I actually get to Paul, which I will do, I wandered over tonight with two student teachers, neither of them that go to Monash, unfortunately. But it was very interesting to have a yarn, just wandering along, coming over here, and I actually think it says something really powerful about the idea of teachers, the profession, and the notion of professional learning, professional development. To see two wonderful young student teachers thinking about coming to a lecture rather than streaming, and I must say we are on the Twitterverse and all of that tonight, and I welcome all those that we're streaming to somewhere. It is a really good thing in this modern day where being live doesn't necessarily mean being here. It is a really good thing to have an audience like this, and actually, getting to you now, Paul, it is testament to what you're speaking about, your knowledge, skill and ability and your professional expertise, that you would attract an audience like this on such a very cool topic as well. Let me just say a few things about Paul. I asked him earlier on if there was anything I wasn't allowed to say. He took a deep breath and he said, just make sure you tell the truth. Oh, let me tell you the truth. I've known Paul for nearly 20 years. We've worked together as colleagues, friends and peers. There are few people who take their research, their teaching, their professionalism as seriously as Paul. And as you will see in his presentation tonight, just as teaching matters, so does professionalism, so does being a scholar, an academic and a standout in the field, and that's certainly what Paul is. He's also our Associate Dean Research in the faculty, and we're all incredibly indebted for what he brings to bear in helping shape the nature of our work, the attitude that we have to research, and our intense belief in the fact that teaching matters and that teachers matter. Paul, it's a pleasure working with you. I think you know that, but I'm pleased to be able to say it publicly. We look forward to your presentation tonight. This is based on a longitudinal study that actually has been very powerful across the literature. He will amaze you with the insights tonight. How's that? I offer to you tonight Professor Paul Richardson. Thank you very much.
Oh, I have to turn this thing on. Well, thank you for coming. I think to give a public lecture is perhaps an act tinged with some level of vanity. But I'm grateful for your company this evening, especially since we've just passed the winter solstice and you could all be at home in front of the fire. And if indeed you are at home in front of the fire and streaming this talk, I think I'm really grateful to you as well for allowing me into your living room or indeed into your study. So the first part of the talk I'm going to complain a lot. This is a privilege you have in these lectures. For more than 30 years and on more occasions than I care to remember, I've read pieces in the news media, heard members of the public and in public bars and all sorts of places, and politicians telling us how easy it is to be a teacher, and always with the implication that anyone could do the job if they had an inclination to enter a school classroom. Since February this year, as part of a very large study involving Year 10 and Year 12 students and their teachers, I've had a remarkable opportunity to go into schools in various parts of suburban and rural Queensland. And that's been a great privilege because it has allowed me to observe and to register some of the changes and some of the continuities since my time as a secondary school teacher in the outer western suburbs and inner city of Sydney. I can assure the politicians and the bureaucrats who only appear in schools for photo opportunities accompanied by a bevy of news media that teaching and teachers matter. Teaching matters in all of its complexity are what I want to talk about in this lecture. So teaching is a process that facilitates learning. And teachers engage. We're ready. So teachers engage in what I would see as an extraordinary ambitious endeavour of human improvement. They seek to improve skills, deepen insights, broaden understanding, transform minds, enrich human capabilities and change behaviour. That is no small task. Learning is central to teaching in that the concept of teaching is tightly conceptually connected to learning. The very raison d'etre of teaching rests on student learning, which involves a change in students' knowledge, beliefs or interests. And changes in students' understandings come with reaching into the social, cultural, motivational, as well as the cognitive realms. So fundamental to the work that teachers do is the intention to move students, to intervene, to engage them with the thoughts and actions that are formative and transformative. In 1938, in his wonderful book called Experience and Education, John Dewey wrote that teaching involved that sympathetic understanding of what is actually going on in the minds of those who are learning. Such a view of teaching is founded on the presumption that education is essentially a social process. I'll have more to say about this in the later part of the lecture. So teaching as a career is unique in that teachers incorporate the motivations of students as integral to their own motivations. How can we identify if a teacher has been successful in their teaching? Well, ironically, teachers can only succeed if they help students acquire some of the elements of their own special expertise: knowledge of a subject, skill in explaining it, strategy in solving problems, and so on. So, to teach is to attentively teach something to someone. I think this is what I've been thinking about for a very long time in my career. Throughout our lifetimes, we engage in both formal and informal learning, and much of our informal learning does not involve teaching. And we can be party to formal learning that does not involve, I'll say that again. We can be party to formal teaching that does not involve learning. So I want to turn now to look at the tasks and roles required of teachers in this day and age, basically. The popular perception of teaching is that teachers teach in classrooms for a few hours a day, some few months of the year, and that's all they do. I'm sure all of you here tonight know that teaching involves much more than teaching students in classrooms. Teachers are expected to undertake a huge variety of tasks that include some of the following. Now that's a very busy slide, and I stopped because I couldn't put any more on. But there are probably other things you can think of that teachers do. They're disciplinarians, they're mentors, they're educators, they're reporting on whether they suspect that children are being abused. They're also preparing lessons and they're doing a whole range of other things around excursions, or they're completing administrative work, which is getting more and more as we know, engaging in their own professional learning, they're monitoring that learning, and they're actually sometimes having to report on that learning. So just taking a look at that list, these tasks are not easily fulfilled, particularly in some social and cultural school contexts. We know from research that in some school contexts, teachers experience constant interruptions. Have you been in a school lately with the bells and interruptions from the microphones and things? And it's a lot. Rule violations, students fail to achieve learning goals, and even are subjected to verbal and physical assaults. But they are charged with maintaining supportive, productive learning environments. And studies conducted in different countries have identified the following as sources of strain and tension for teachers. not surprisingly. Work intensification, heavy workload, negative professional interactions with colleagues, inadequate salary, students with behaviour problems, over-assertive and demanding parents, poor school leadership, and sometimes the absence of autonomy. So one might ask, what do teachers actually need to know? Well, thankfully in his book, Teaching as Community Property, Lee Schulman speculated about the category headings that might be identified for a handbook or encyclopedia representing the knowledge base of teaching. And he suggested that at a minimum, the following would need to be included. Well, content knowledge to begin with, general pedagogical knowledge with reference to those broad principles and strategies of classroom management organisation that appear to transcend subject matter, curriculum knowledge with particular grasp of the materials, the tools of the trade that teachers have, pedagogical content knowledge, which is a very special amalgam of content and pedagogy that is uniquely the province of teachers and their own special form of professional understanding, knowledge of learners and their characteristics, knowledge of educational context ranging across a whole range of things from classrooms to groups to governance of schools and districts, and also communities and cultures of schools, and knowledge of educational ends, including the purposes, values, and the philosophical and historical foundations or grounding of those. Schulman went on to identify 4 sources of teaching knowledge base, which he called the scholarship and content disciplines, the materials and settings of the institutionalised educational process, and teaching on schooling, research on schooling, social organisations, human learning, teaching and development, and other social and cultural phenomena. And the last one, which I want to also come back to, is the wisdom of practice. Beautiful term, the wisdom of practice. In the Handbook on Research on Teaching, as far back as 1986, probably before some of you here were born, Gary Fenstermacher, who was a very well-known philosopher, argued that it was not sufficient for teachers to perform skillfully, it was also essential to educate teachers to reason soundly about their teaching. To reason soundly requires both a process of thinking about what teacher is doing and a base of facts, principles and experiences from which to reason. Training teachers to behave in a prescribed way is not educating them to reason. So for Fenstermacher, good teaching is not only effective behaviourally, it also rests on a foundation of adequately grounded premises that support reasoned development. In passing, I would suggest that teacher education programs and programs of professional learning for teachers could distinguish those practices and processes that prescribe and inculcate certain teaching behaviours from those that lay the foundations on which to scaffold sound reasoning. Even a cursory perusal of Lee Schulman's knowledge base for teaching insists that effective teaching is built on a complex knowledge base that is formal, explicit, grounded in research, scholarship, and providing a bedrock for reasoned practice. Over time, teaching can also build tacit knowledge, as Polanyi called it, derived from practice that teachers mostly share through narrative accounts of teaching events and episodes, or what Schulman has called the wisdom of practice. So what am I saying? I'm trying to say that the job of teaching requires complex knowledge base, sophisticated, sound, explicit reasoning, as well as tacit knowledge honed from experience in actually teaching and interacting with students. This is a far cry from how many people think about teaching as only as a delivery system for information, including those who relentlessly promote new digital technologies as the basis of a new way of learning and teaching. Schools, students and teachers now have unprecedented access to digital technologies, and we hear much about 21st century skills, personal learning networks, flipped classrooms, bring your own device and an iPad for every child, accompanied by promises of how digital devices and access to the digital world of connectivity will transform contemporary education. No matter how many devices teachers and students have to access We will miss the point if we allow technologists to portray effective teaching as a delivery system for information. In my view, we must insist that effective teaching is grounded in relationships. So I want to turn now to dispel a singularly irritating myth about teachers and teaching that has its origins in my own years as a secondary school teacher. So teachers have a great job, don't you know this? Teachers have a great job because they have a short working day, long holidays 3 times a year, and all you have to do, I don't know why you're laughing, I don't think it's funny. And, you know, they have a great time. So what's the evidence about the hours teachers actually work? And how do these hours compare with other occupations? Australian labour statistics, I found these from year 2010, they sort of suit my argument in a way. And I checked out recently and the hours haven't gone up much. Managers have the highest hours according to the Australian labour market statistics, 43.3 hours a week on average. So, this is audience participation time. Sorry for those who are streaming. What's the actual average hours for teachers worked in Australia?
90 hours.
90? Right, okay. Any further bids on 90 and 100? All right. To stop you all guessing for any much longer. I did some work looking at across the UK, US, Germany, New Zealand and Australia. In UK, you can see back in 2005, these are numbers that are quite respectable samples. 52 and 50. In US, 54. Intriguingly, if they include the weekend, it's 58. That's an interesting idea in itself. 9,000 odd teachers in 14 samples in Germany, 49 hours. And in New Zealand, 2 studies done by Ingverson and colleagues, 47 in 2005, you can see in 2016. Not surprisingly, the numbers have gone up for secondary school teachers, 55 hours a week. The recent studies by Weldon and Ingverson, done by ACER for the AEU, came out with 53 hours, and a study that Helen Watt and I have been doing for a long period of time, the longitudinal study, my RA, Tim Powers, pulled these numbers out for us. It comes out at about 49 hours. And these are mid-career people. These are people who've been teaching somewhere between 8 and 15 years. So let me say, next time you're at a barbecue and you get the chance, you might be able to say to people, just slip it into the conversation seamlessly. You know, give them the facts about the hours. We live in a post-fact world, so, you know, just try and seamlessly slip it in. But I think it's interesting that either teachers are very good at lying across languages and across data, across countries, or there's something in it. And I think there's something in it when you get that sort of confirmation of large data. So what motivates people to choose teaching as a career? This has been something that has been of interest to me for a very long time and to my colleague, Professor Helen Watt. For a 10-year period, I was a course director for a graduate diploma in education program, which attracted a large proportion of people intent on leaving their prior careers to become teachers. Did these aspiring career switches into teaching hold values, beliefs, expectancies in common? What would motivate a broad cross-section of people who have diverse experiences in work and life to want to become teachers? And what sustains them once they are entering into the profession? It seemed obvious that the talents and demonstrated abilities in other occupations of these people undermined the simplistic notion often promulgated in the media at the time that people who want to become teachers are those unable to pursue more prestigious careers, so they go into teaching as a fallback. Have you heard that before? Yeah, on a regular basis, unfortunately, over too much of my life. Were there reasons for switching to teaching career as diverse as the individuals themselves, or were their core motivations shared by people who want to be teachers in general? From these musings, two questions were formed. Why do people from demanding, high status and financially rewarding careers want to switch into teaching? And what motivates people to choose teaching at all? So the motivational factors influencing teaching choice study began. The question of why people choose teaching as a career is at the base of a longitudinal program of research which we began 16 years ago. And it's founded on 2007 beginning teacher education students across 4 universities in 2 Australian states. I should say this work has been generously funded over the years by the Australian Research Council, and we are very grateful to them for everything they've ever given us. An acknowledgement of our funders. So, together with my colleague Professor Helen Watt, we've followed the trajectories over a long period of time of the original sample who are now in their mid-career. And we're defining mid-career somewhere around 8 to 15 years in teaching. So let me say something about the phase and the design of the study. So we began with the students in their first year, in their first weeks of teacher education. I'm not sure you can read all the details, but watch the bars go across and I'll explain. Phase 1 is entry. Phase 2 is prior to their qualifying teacher education. So these are the same people that we followed. And then phase 3 is people who are in their early career. And we just are now finalising, or at least finalising the data collection for what is phase 4. Now phase 4 are people who've been out and are now in mid-career, and I'll say more about this. The program began with the development of our Fit Choice theoretical framework and scale. We needed some way of gathering this data and develop a way of actually measuring primary motivations of teachers to teach. Now, this is our model, and all parts of the model do work together, and I'll run through it really quickly. If this... No, this is not going to help me. All right. Doesn't matter. I'll talk about it. So socialisation influences at the top, social dissuasion, prior teaching and learning experience, social influences. This is looking at the choice of teaching right at the bottom, so people who are going through this process. Intrinsic value, we looked at personal utility value around job security, time for family, job transferability, and then we also looked at the social utility values around shape the future of children and adolescents, a very important dimension one would think in terms of teaching, work with children, make a social contribution and make enhance social equity. We also asked about their perceived teaching ability. This is right at the beginning of their career. And then questions to do with the nature of the task demand in terms of how expert was the career, how demanding did they expect it to be, and then how high in social status and salary. And we also included right over there something called fallback career. Why do we include it? Because it's been around in the literature and also we keep hearing a lot about it. And we wondered, well, let's ask people, let's find out. Do people choose it as a fallback career? The answer is coming. So, from our point of view, there is nothing as practical as a good theory. If you have no theory and you've only got the practice, then you don't actually have a way of explaining a lot of what happens over time and to be able to look at outcomes. So we began the longitudinal program of research into beginning teachers' motivations, engagement, coping and wellbeing, with the observation that teachers at large, represent a large heterogeneous workforce in countries around the world and are likely to differ in terms of their expectations, their beliefs, their goals, values and perceptions of what it means to be a teacher. So the Fit Choice model enables the comparative measurement of teacher motivations not only locally but also in diverse socio-cultural contexts. And this has become really important because the scale, the instrument now, has been translated into 18 different languages and there are samples around the world in all of those languages. I'll talk about some in a minute. So in the original sample of early childhood, primary and secondary future teachers, the highest rated motivations were ability. Perceived ability to teach motivations. In terms of shaping the future, work with youth, and then if you go right down to the bottom, have a look which is the lowest rated. All right? So, I mean, it's reassuring for us in some ways. If you look at the social values, shape the future, work with youth, and then make a social contribution and to contribute to social equity, these are all the social values that are rated as part of the study. In terms of the personal ones, personal values around job security and job transferability and time for family, these are lower rated. The two lowest rated areas there around social influences, this is people who were persuaded into teaching by others and also fallback career. They might be lowest rated, but we've followed these people over a very long period of time, and those two motivations turn out to be very, very interesting. People who've been persuaded into teaching turn out to be not the best people in a sense in terms of their relationships with students and their teaching styles, etc. But I'm not going to go into that tonight. In terms of the perceptions, well, right at the beginning, they perceived it to be a difficult career and high in expertise, requiring high levels of expertise and specialised knowledge. But they'd also experienced a fair degree of dissuasion away from the career. They saw that social status as being moderate, salary as being low, and satisfaction. Despite all of these things and understanding all these things, they were still very satisfied with having chosen the career. So you would think people who are low on the salary, they're not people going into it because they want to make a lot of money. And when politicians say, we'll throw some more money at teachers and they'll be happy, or we'll attract them in, might not be a good idea. So we then thought, well, we better see, since we have all these colleagues around the world, we better start looking at teaching motivations in different contexts. So Turkey, China, USA, Switzerland, Germany, Croatia, Netherlands. And we published this as a special issue in 2012. In studies across diverse settings, motivations core to choosing the teaching profession are ability motivations. Not just wanting to work with children or just loving kids or whatever else. Ability motivations. These are, I have the ability. I perceive that I have the ability. And intrinsic motivation, I'm intrinsically motivated, which were highest rated, but lower, much lower or considerably lower in collectivist cultures where career choice may be less an individualistic interest or in terms of their individual's abilities. Altruistic and social utility values were lower in more egalitarian cultures where perceived need to achieve social equity is likely lower. And personal utility values were moderate and lower than intrinsic ability and social utility motivations. But importantly, in every single sample, fallback career was rated low. It was the lowest rated in every sample, revealing that teaching is in fact a choice, not an accident. So it does seem that there are core teacher motivations, which takes me back to the very first question I was asking. And context shapes the prominence of individualistic, collectivistic, or personally utilitarian motivations. Future teachers perceive teaching as an expert career requiring specialised and technical knowledge with an emotionally demanding and heavy workload. At the same time, they perceived it as relatively low in social status and in salary. And despite these, they were still happy with the career, whichever way they looked at it. So given our large sample, we wondered whether there might be different types of beginning teachers. We were indeed able to detect distinctly different types of beginning teachers according to their motivational profiles, which highlight different nascent teacher identities even in the outset of their careers. So these are different profiles of beginning teachers as they were to enter into their profession, into the career. And I'll just suggest to you, the ones at the top, Follow the line, the red line. You can see if you look at the bottom, effort, professional development, aspirations, so they perceived how much effort they were going to put in. We asked them about that when they went into teaching. Their professional development aspirations, their intentions to persist in the profession, like were they going to stay there, and their leadership aspirations. So, the first group we identified, we call them the highly engaged persisters. These were motivated by intrinsic career value, perceived teaching abilities, social utility values, and were least on fallback. You'll see that they're high across all of the dimensions that we were looking at. The second group we named the highly engaged switchers. And if you look at where the switcher is pointing, these people were equally high with the first group on effort, equally high on professional development aspirations, much lower on their intentions to persist, and equally high on leadership aspirations. Now, they're a very interesting group because these people had a plan. They were only going to stay 5 years. They were going to do something else after that period of time. And most of them were able to say to us and tell us what they were going to do. So these were people right at the end of their teacher education who were actually planning another career within a 5-year period. Think about why people leave in 5 years. The highly engaged switchers scored similarly on social utility and intrinsic values and were not planning to stay that long in the career. They had something else they were going to do. But they were very, very interested in leadership and leadership possibilities. They were also younger. The lower engaged assisters were a rather negative group in one sense, and look at the percentage of the sample they actually represent. So they are lower on their planned effort, they're lower on their planned professional development, they are much lower on their intentions to persist, and very low on leadership. This is an interesting group, a rather negative profile, and they'd had not a very good experience during their teacher education program. They'd also experienced the demanding nature of teachers' work, lack of structural supports in schools, and perceived the lack of career prospects and insecure employment as being a deterrent. By comparing differential changes in motivations over time, it'll come as no surprise to you that the first years of teaching were of interest to us. The highly engaged persisters, who exhibited an apparently highly positive profile at the end of teacher education, appeared the most psychologically vulnerable to stressors during early career experience. They experienced reduced career satisfaction, planned persistence went down, and their own confidence and self-efficacies declined. This appeared to be at the price of continuing to hold highly idealistic motivations in environments where they may not be able to be attained. The highly engaged switchers adjusted their motivations downwards to sustain their level of planned persistence, self-efficacy and satisfaction with the choice of career, but they also planned to leave. Lower engaged assisters, these are people who did make it into teaching because we followed them. So they went in with this profile, if you know what I mean. We followed them as well. Those that did go into teaching appeared to find the rewards from the career that allowed their motivations to be adjusted upwards, and their satisfaction with choice of the career went up as well. Their plan to persist increased to some degree, and their self-efficacies remained stable. So discrepancies between the demands and resources of the profession and individual teaching motivations foreground motivational adjustments as an adaptive coping mechanism in response to contextual demands, and reflect changes in the degree to which being a teacher is integral to these different profiles. So this research has shown that teacher career motivation is multidimensional, complex, and has an impact on teachers' planned persistence, commitment and professional engagement, even up to 7 years in teaching. I turn now to examine different types of professional emotional coping among beginning teachers. This is a very interesting question in many ways, the different types that might be possible. And we were very influenced by a very large German study by Shishka in the 90s, I think, where they were able to look at the careers and the emotional and professional coping of a very large sample of people from the caring professions that included teachers, police, nurses, and other professionals that they had in that group. How teachers cope with the demands of teaching will vary from person to person. Among Australian early career teachers, we were able to identify 6 types of coping profiles which have varying implications for career outcomes, teacher wellbeing, and also for the students that they probably teach. So this is the model that we drew on to begin with. The vertical looks at the psychological wellbeing and the professional commitment. And they came out with, from the German study, with 4 groups that they were able to identify. The excessive ambitious, I'm going to put these up first. The excessive ambitious were low on well-being but high on commitment. And I'm sure you've all worked with people who are excessively ambitious. The good health people were high on professional commitment, but they're also high on psychological well-being. They also identified what they called the sparing group. They're high on well-being but very low on commitment. And then, of course, there's the burnout group. The burnout group are usually people who are suffering from emotional exhaustion, and it manifests in various ways, but it's an important area to look at. The other thing about their study was that they suggested that the excessive ambitious group could, in fact, in time, move into being the burnout group, and there was some evidence of that in their study. So what did we find? Well, with early career teachers, one would hope that you wouldn't, well, you mightn't find, hope you'd find burnout maybe, but not severe burnout. It's too early in the definition of that. But we found what we called the healthy ambitious. And they're healthy probably because they haven't had all that long in the career. They weren't all that low on well-being, but they were certainly high on commitment. We discovered also that the people who we thought of as being burnt in terms of the model, burnout, they were more on a path to burnout. They weren't low, but they were certainly on that trajectory. What was alarming was that in the literature there'd been talk from the mid-90s about an idea that a guy just put out there, Stevenson, I've forgotten his first name, about worn-out teachers. And it was an interesting idea, and we began to think about whether we could actually empirically demonstrate that. And in fact we did. We did find a group of people who you would describe as worn out. These people who we were describing as worn out have the profile that they've disinvested. They've basically given up their work, engagement, they're low on their own well-being and their coping, and they're affected by work stressors in a way that is emotionally unhealthy for them. And if these people stay in the profession, we can assume that this profile is likely to continue to have reduced work goals, lowered idealism and responsibility for work outcomes, heightened emotional detachment, work alienation and self-interest as a guiding principle for them. And this profile is probably the most negative and likely to become worse as the years in the job progress. The sparing and the good health, not surprisingly, were pretty low on any form of distress. The sparing are high on well-being, low on commitment. Probably not the sort of person you want to employ. The good health, they're high on both, and good luck to them. We also found another group, which was very interesting. These were distinguishable, empirically distinguishable. The diligent. The diligent were, like the ambitious, they were a bit in the middle. They did the job well, they were committed, but they were not doing as badly as one might think in some ways, or could have been. But I want to show you this. What alarmed us more than anything else, of the sample of 560 odd people, 27% of those people were in the path to burnout or worn out. Now, these are people who are in their first years of teaching. So it was an interesting outcome for us. I want to talk now about the relational work of teaching. This is something that I began with and I said I would pick up. The ability to create positive relationships with students is not normally a prerequisite for becoming a teacher, and yet it is fundamental to teaching. Socio-emotional development is not always at the fore in teacher education, nor are teachers' evaluations of their work based on the quality of these relationships. If you teach or have taught adolescents, you will know that effective teaching requires more than a mastery of content knowledge and pedagogy. Teaching, I think, is a messy job, and I take this from a quote that I think is a wonderful piece. Teachers who make efforts to reach out to students and interact with them on a human level appear to make significant academic inroads while finding deep personal rewards. I think that's a really important thing to think about. The people who've had the most influence on you in your academic career probably also were able to work at a human level. I recently walked through the grounds and buildings of a secondary school in South Brisbane, a very low SES school, I must say, with a teacher who in the course of that walk spoke to at least 20 plus students who were in various age year levels. In those brief encounters, it was clear that he knew the personal and family histories of those students. His interactions were respectful, personal and caring. He was relating on a human level. He asked about their older sisters and brothers and how they were doing, whether some of them had been to the breakfast club that morning, how was footy training, commiserated with one boy whose team had lost on the weekend, and inquired of another whether the rocket he was building was close to being finished. As incidental and fleeting as these interactions were, all of those students responded positively to his interest in them. No more than 20 minutes later, I heard him in an assembly for all Year 10 students being the disciplinarian, expressing deeply felt disappointment that some members of the school community had behaved badly by engaging in racially based fighting in the school and then in the community. He spoke of community and the need for respect, which he had demonstrated just minutes earlier. But in the assembly of 150 students, he was facing up to the reality of the social and racial attitudes, beliefs, prejudices, stereotypes and tensions that students carry with them into the school and into classrooms. So why do I focus on this one teacher? This teacher has a PhD in microbiology, previously worked as a medical researcher in a university, but chose teaching as a career and now has chosen to work in low SES school. He likes teaching and he thinks of teaching as a messy job and is more than aware that many of the students in the school face personal challenges and stresses outside the school. He has created many science subjects for students who will not graduate high school. The boys who play football and for the school, big thing in Queensland, not Australian rules, proper football. He had created a subject which was all about physiology. They're not going to graduate high school. He exemplifies for me how effective teachers make academic inroads and find deeply personal rewards in doing so. So what sustains mid-career teachers from our Phase 4 data? We asked them some questions. These are people who've been out, they're mid-career, they've been out sometimes up to 15 years. What do you enjoy most about teaching? What is it about the job that you find most satisfying? In your current job, can you describe how you feel about your work? Tim Powers did this for me. He's a wonderful RA to have. So the centrepiece is students for me, students. And activities, community, classroom, intellectual relationships. These are some of the things they said when we asked those questions. I like the one at the top. The things I do: first, 1, relationships; 2, the culture of my classroom. But I think it's really a revelation as to what actually makes people who are teachers very satisfied with what they're doing. And it meets their needs and sustains them. I enjoy it because it's dynamic. I love working with the kids. It's definitely not a dull job. I suspect many of you have come from that not dull job today. We also asked them about the frustrations and what undermines their commitment. What do you like least about teaching, and what has been the most challenging aspects of your experience of teaching? Reporting, demanding, constrained, changing, marking, administrative. I won't go on. But I'll let them say what they said. I think student behaviour is a problem. I don't think I would stay if I had to deal with it all the time. I just feel like it's never actually achieved to get through every single thing that's demanded of us as teachers. The sheer volume of work, and so on. And whoever said earlier on in the night, 60 hours, you have a companion at the top who does 60 to 70 hours a week, some weeks. And I think that's the other thing. I had up actual average hours. To get those average hours, somebody's got to be doing a lot more, and perhaps somebody's doing a lot less, but there's a range in there. An observation made some time ago, I'll come to that in a minute. An observation made some time ago that teachers are workers, teaching is work, and the school is a workplace, has important ramifications for teachers' motivations and for understanding them, and the formation and development of their professional identities. In many countries recently, there has been an intense focus on teacher quality, early career attrition, work intensification, and accountabilities to measures to refashion teachers' daily working lives. Way back in 1932, Willard Waller, who was a sociologist, wrote a book about the school. And in that book, he said, "The school is a social world in which children and teachers are tied together in a complex maze of social interactions." He said a lot of other things in that book that I don't like, but I think that piece is a very nice thing to say. It is in specific school cultures and workplace environments governed by local and global social and political forces that teachers, not only students, realise their career motivations and goals and configure their personal and social identities as teachers. So I want to conclude with some observations concerning teachers and teaching in challenging environments and challenging contexts, especially at a time when we are experiencing profound changes in the nature of work, the dismantling of the welfare state, challenges to democratic values and institutions, and the emergence of a growing number of people who are disengaged, disenfranchised from civic and political life. In an era of globalisation, the rhetoric and agenda of utilitarianism as opposed to egalitarianism has become all-powerful. In short, the neoliberal model believes in a competitive market economy regulated only enough to ensure that market forces operate to guarantee the fittest are the winners. And where there are winners, there of course must be losers, who must be convinced that it is their fault that they are not competitive enough. Youth, the old, poor, migrants and refugees, the unemployed and the underemployed, just to mention a few. There is robust evidence in many contemporary societies such as the UK, Europe, USA and Australia that the discrepancy between the wealth of the privileged elite and the working poor and underemployed is ever widening and becoming more entrenched. The poorest members of our commonwealth and their children are most likely to be found in the least privileged, inadequately resourced schools where there is the greatest possibility and need to value add. Globally, we are now seeing the formation of a new class of people. They are employed on short-term casual contracts, undertaking various types of work requiring them to be highly flexible and adaptive in the times and hours they work. These are what Guy Standing has called and identified as the members of the precariat, discernible by their job and employment insecurity, lack of negotiating power in relation to working conditions, subject to somewhat arbitrary rules of hiring and firing, and income insecurity, and a lack of prospects and future life planning. A significant proportion of these people have completed qualifications and then find they have few opportunities for ongoing employment. They are forced to piece together paid work from various sources without the prospects of continuing employment or ongoing financial security. They find themselves in what is increasingly called the gig economy. Psychologically detached, insecure, confused, left out, and all of which forecasts, in my view, social and political disengagement, civic detachment and dissipation of the idea of the common good. The commonwealth is now an uncommon Enlightenment ideal in the jingle-jangle of the populist revolt against the politics of privilege. So in these circumstances, can we expect teachers to value add and compensate for such social inequality, inequity, social dislocation, and nurture those who are marginalised from civic life? Schools that serve communities with high unemployment, underemployment, distressed families, recent migrant arrivals and refugees from war-torn countries often provide important experiences of safe, respectful communities which engender a sense of collective responsibility and some degree of social cohesion, as well as providing a future time perspective for underprivileged and under-resourced young people and their families. So earlier I presented graphs showing that teacher motivation is complex and multidimensional. People who are motivated to make a social contribution, contribute to social equity, work with and shape the future of youth fit well with the challenging environments such as those I've just been describing. So I want to conclude with the proposition that people who are motivated by the desire to make a social contribution and contribute to social equity, and those whose goals are to build strong personal relationships with young people, are also likely to be providing the social and psychological support as a significant adult in the lives of youth who are struggling to make their way in an aggressive, individualistic world. In my view, teaching and teachers do indeed matter. Thank you.